Hey, welcome back. So in this section I want to talk about the gameplay framework and provide a bit of an overview. We will keep this in mind when we implement the camera setup for our game. For this particular game we will have a different camera setup because it's not an FPS or third-person shooter where the camera follows the player, or as with the typical rollerball game where the camera sort of follows the ball around. Instead we will have a static camera. The setup that we are looking to achieve will be very flexible because it will allow the artist or the level designer to go ahead and add cameras in the level if they want, and then specify a different camera through which the player will view the game when we actually hit play. So we want to look at how we can set that up, and for this we need to keep the gameplay framework in mind. So what is responsible for what? For example, the player controller contains the player camera manager, which is responsible, of course, for managing the camera. This particular flowchart is from the Unreal Engine documentation. This provides us with a high-level overview on how these core gameplay classes relate to each other. So these are gameplay classes here. At the top we have the game mode, and the game state. The game mode and the game state is basically the definition of the game. So it will include things like the game rules, the win conditions, and the game state is going to contain the state of the game, such as the score and where certain elements are in your level, what missions you have completed, and so forth. At this point in the course we are not concerned with replication, so in other words multiplayer games. We are building really simple games here, so I'm not really going to discuss that, but many of these elements are useful for multiplayer games. So human players that join the game are associated with player controllers. The player controllers allow us to possess pawns, so in other words take control of those pawns. And as you can see, the player controller contains things such as a HUD for heads-up display. It affords players input controls and also a camera manager for handling camera views, as we can see with the player camera manager. Also notice that an AI controller can also possess a pawn. So firstly let's think a bit about what a controller is again. A controller is an actor. Remember, that is also a class that is responsible for basically directing a pawn. So we have the player controller and the AI controller, and as I mentioned, the player controller is basically an interface between the pawn and the human player that controls it. It kind of represents the will of the player. So we want the paddle or the basket to move to the left and to the right. So we press the A or the D keys to move the paddle or the basket to the left and to the right. That is the player's will. We want that thing to move. Whereas with an AI controller that does not represent a human player, that essentially represents or simulates a will that can also control a pawn. We also have a character which is also a pawn, and that's a humanoid style pawn with additional functionality. But for this particular project we are focused here on the pawn. So let's get back to the player controller. Again, that is what we are going to use to set up our view into the level, our view into the game. So the player camera manager is basically the camera or the view or the eyeballs for the player into our virtual levels and into our virtual world. Some of these classes have functionality that we will use in upcoming lectures to set up the camera, and also keeping the level designers in mind so that they can choose what camera they want us to view the world from. Notice the separation between these classes, such as the separation between the pawn and the player controller or the AI controller. This gives us more flexibility in our approach to game design, since we can use the same player controller to possess different pawns. As an example, in this example in the Unreal Editor, I will go ahead and I will search in the outliner. I will search for player controller, and notice that it does not show up. So if I go ahead and simulate or play, notice that the player controller will show up. Okay, so the player controller actor actually gets spawned into our level when we hit play. And the same thing if I just type player here instead of player controller. If I simulate now, notice that we get the player controller, the player state, and we also get the player camera manager. A player state is the state of a human player or a bot that is simulating a player. Data that may be contained in a player state includes the player's name, the score, whether the player is currently carrying the flag, such as in a capture the flag game. We will not be modifying the player controller, so whatever default player controller we have or that gets spawned into the world, all we have to do is to access a function that is on that player controller, and I will show you how we can do that. The thing is, the player controller does not exist in the level until we actually play the game, and as I mentioned, we want to afford the level designer the ability to choose which camera they want, and so we're going to do that in a different way. We are actually going to use the level blueprints for that. or level scripts. Okay, with that we are going to wrap up this lecture. Keep this framework in mind, these relationships between these classes in mind as we move forward.